was a child and into my younger adulthood, one of my favorite cookies was a raisin sandwich cookie made by Sunshine, going by the name of something like Sunshine Golden Fruit Biscuits or Golden Raisin Biscuits. It was a cookie that was not too sweet, and it was crunchy, and it came in strips that you would break apart. Recently, for reasons I can't explain, I got a craving for the cookies. So I went to the supermarket and looked for them and discovered that Sunshine has not made them for years. Well, I was determined to find some way to get them, so I looked on the internet and found that there were some commercial cookies that were similar but were very expensive when you add the shipping, since none were available locally. I did a recipe search, and I discovered that the Sunshine cookie was actually based on an Italian cookie known as a Garibaldi, which is also a raisin sandwich, but it uses a much richer pastry-like dough. And I wanted the more cracker-like crisp dough that Sunshine made. I found a cookie recipe that had the right taste, but the wrong texture. The dough was too thick, and instead of being crunchy, they were sort of chewy. So I played around with the ingredients, and I played around with the way it was rolled out and baked. And I have something that is a reasonable approximation of it. This is a fairly easy cookie to make, but you do have to follow the instructions carefully since it can get messed up. Some of my earlier attempts were not anything you would want to see or eat. As with most baking recipes, the first thing that we'll do is to preheat the oven to 375 degrees. After we preheat the oven, we're going to prepare the raisin filling. We're using raisins rather than currants, which seem to be more traditional because raisins are less expensive and they work just fine. They're a little large, but we'll take care of that later. What I did to prepare the raisin filling was to put 1.5 cups of raisins in a small pot with 3/4 cup of cold water. I brought it to a boil and I let it simmer until all the water was absorbed. When the water is absorbed, your raisins are going to look nice and soft and plump. We're going to set this aside. They'll be chopped later. The reason that we're not going to chop them now is that we're going to make our dough in the food processor. And if we chop them now in the food processor, we'd have to clean out the bowl because it would be too sticky to make the dough. By doing the dough first, we can then chop the raisins and save ourselves a cleaning. All right, now the dough is all made in the food processor by mixing the dry ingredients first and then adding the wets all at once, similar to the way you would make muffins or waffles. Right, now I'm going to add 2.5 cups of all-purpose flour to the work bowl of my food processor. Now, to get the right amount of flour, I use a sort of stir and spoon in method that I find works very nicely. I give the flour a stir and I spoon it into my measuring cup loosely without packing it down. And once it's all heaped up like that, I take a flat edge. Using a spoon like this makes it easy. You don't have to switch between a spoon and a knife. And that's 1 cup. I do the same for another 1.5 cups. All right, now we're going to add 1/3 cup of granulated sugar. Ensure that we don't have any lumps that will distort the amount that we're measuring. That goes right in there. 1/4 teaspoon of salt. And we're going to use some baking soda, which is a little bit unusual since most recipes use baking powder. When you use baking soda, your liquids need to include something acidic, which it does, as you'll see, to neutralize the baking soda. I think this is partly responsible for the unique flavor of the crackers, so I didn't mess around with it. Alright, so we need a half a teaspoon of baking soda. And one of the things that I do from sad experience is that after I've measured it out, I run it through my fingers. If you've ever bitten into a little lump of undissolved baking soda, you know why we want to make sure there aren't any there. You can also use a little strainer if you want, but I find that this is a good step. Alright, now we're going to mix these together. Let me get the sugar away so I don't dump it on the floor. And I'm going to just pulse it briefly to combine all the ingredients. Right, now we have our dry ingredients all mixed, and we're going to add the wets all at once. What I've done here is I've mixed together 3 tablespoons of vegetable oil. I used canola oil, but any neutral vegetable oil will do. Half a cup of water, and 2 tablespoons of beaten egg. I took a whole egg, I opened it up in a little dish, I mixed it up, I measured out 2 tablespoons and put it in here. The rest is used to glaze the dough, which is really a very nice arrangement. If you've ever broken a whole egg to use for a glaze and discovered you've used about a teaspoon of it and then had to decide what to do with the rest of it. So that works nicely. And 1 1/4 teaspoons of white vinegar. That's the acid that's going to work with the baking soda. Alright, now we dump it in all at once. Let me just get this out of the way. And we're going to process it until it just forms a ball. Check and see how we're doing. That looks fine. We don't want to over process it. So let me see. When it clears the bowl, it'll look like this. Alright, we're going to knead it a little bit to smooth it out, but this is now ready to work. What I'm using here is a silicone mat called a rule pat. It doesn't slide. In case you're wondering what the difference between a rule pat and a sill pat is, if you've heard that, sill pats tend to be used for baking on them instead of parchment, but they will slide a bit. The rule pat is designed not to move, even though you can also bake with it. And what I'm going to do is to dump out the dough from my food processor here. I'm going to need a spatula to get out the rest of it. I'm going to knead it lightly. As you can see, the bowl is pretty clean. It's always better to undermix slightly than to overmix, which will give you a tough dough. Alright. Let me clear this stuff away, and then we'll knead the dough. This is not like kneading bread dough in that we don't want to develop gluten. Gluten is what makes bread stretchy and lets the yeast do its work. But if you develop too much gluten for other kinds of pastry, you're going to get a tough pastry. What we're really doing here is kneading all the crumbs together. If you've made pastry dough, you're probably familiar with this. We just want to get something that will be able to roll. We don't want to incorporate too much extra flour in it, but this looks like a nice workable dough.